Hello, everybody. My name is John Levy. I'm the founder of Influence for Good, and today we have an incredible guest with us. Famed economist Nouriel Roubini is here to tell us a little bit about what we can expect as both the domestic and global impact on the economy from the COVID-19 outbreak. You probably know about Nouriel because as early as 2006, he was telling the world about the high risk of the subprime mortgage issues, which eventually led to the 2008 Great Recession. Now he's with us to talk about the incredible implications of what he calls the Greater Recession or Greater Depression. Nouriel, thank you so much for joining us. We are so happy that you're here to talk.
Thank you, John. Thank you to all of you for making time in your busy days to come and listen. I think you'll be able to submit some questions, and I'll leave some time for your questions towards the end. And so I'd like to talk about what are going to be the consequences on the economy and financial markets of this coronavirus crisis. And yesterday I published an op-ed, my column for Project Syndicate, that is titled A Greater Depression, ? And why I'm talking about the possibility of a Greater Depression. I do it for the following reason. At this point, for reason I'm going to explain in a few minutes, we're going to have a global recession. And this global recession is not going to be just a recession, but it's going to be a greater recession. Why I call it the Greater Recession? Because it's going to be more severe than the global financial crisis that occurred with the bust of housing and subprime starting in 2006. So at this point, I would say, even on Wall Street, even the International Monetary Fund, even other policymakers agree that we're going to have a nasty recession. And this recession is going to be worse than the one we had about 10 years ago. So that's the baseline, or what we would call the conventional wisdom or the consensus. It was not a consensus a month ago when I was warning about it, but at this point, people have gotten reality check and realize it's going to get ugly. Now, my worry is that we'll be lucky if we have only a greater recession, meaning a recession worse than the one we had 10 years ago, because there are conditions under which this greater recession may end up into a greater depression. And by greater depression, I mean a depression similar to the one that the world experienced in the 1930s. We are not there. We can avoid it. This might just end up being a greater recession. But I think that there's a rising risk, for reason I'm going to discussing, that this greater recession ends up into a greater depression. So there are bad news and even worse news, but maybe we can avoid the depression. So let me try to elaborate my argument and explain you why there is a risk of a greater depression. The first observation I'll make is the following one. If you look at the shock to the global economy and markets coming from this coronavirus crisis, this shock has been both faster and more severe and more deep, both than the global financial crisis of 2007-9, and even of the Great Depression of the 1930s. Why? In those two previous episodes, were the train wreck, but this was a slow motion train wreck that it took essentially 3 years to become a full crash. It started with a financial shock, stock market crashing in 29, or the bust of housing in 2006, and in slow motion, slowly, the trouble became bigger. Went from the stock market to the mortgage markets or debt markets, and then you had a slowdown of economic activity, then a beginning of a recession, then bankruptcies, then banks going belly up, then credit spreads widening, and of course, unemployment rate above 10% 10 years ago, and it went to above 20% during the 1930s. But it was a slow motion train wreck. It took about 3 years. This time around, instead, this has not been initially a financial shock, it's been like a real medical health shock, like the coronavirus and the sudden stop of economic activity because we have to try to stop this pandemic. And the entire set of events that I discussed have occurred not in 3 years, but in 3 weeks. It's taken only 2 weeks for the stock market to go into what people call bear market territory, meaning falling more than 20%. And it recently was as down as 35%. 2 weeks. Typically it takes about 3 to 4 months from that to happen. It has taken 3 weeks for the entire debt markets, where the junk bonds and other bonds are being issued, to be seized. And the spread of the cost of capital for those who borrow in that market to go through the roof. It took years for the same kind of thing happening 10 years ago.
Can I ask a brief question about this? So for those of us who don't really know what junk bonds are and what you essentially described, can you give us like a 2-second explanation?
Well, there are 2 types of corporate bonds. Bonds that are issued by corporations that are highly graded, they have cash, profit, capital, they're doing well. And then there are bonds that are issued by corporations that have a lot of debt, leverage, were not as profitable. If you're a safe corporation, your bonds are called investment grade, and the interest rate that is paid above, say, safe treasury is maybe 100 basis points, 200 basis points. Typically, instead, junk bonds have an interest rate above safe assets, say 3 months ago, of 300 basis points. It was too low. Now think of it, from 300 basis points or 3% above treasuries, that interest rates are now on junk bonds of these highly risky corporations has gone to 1,100 basis points. So it's gone from 3% to 11% above treasury. At that interest rate, of course, the probability of default is so high that nobody can issue any bonds, and therefore that market is seized. So people worry a lot about the stock market, but actually for economic activity, the bond market is more important, because if corporations cannot issue debt, then they're going to go bankrupt, and the economic shock coming from a credit crisis is going to be more severe than the economic shock coming from a stock market crisis. Why do I say that? In US, there is a huge amount of income and wealth inequality. The stock market can go down 20%, 30%, but 90% of the stock market is owned by 10% of the richest people. The bottom of the distribution of income, half of the people don't have any stocks. So the wealth effect on the poor people from the stock market crashing is minimal. But if the credit markets, the market for corporate bonds, for lending by banks to households, to corporates, to small businesses seizes up like it is right now, then the credit crisis or credit crunch can lead to an economic crisis that is more severe than the stock market crash. That's why what has happened in the bond market is very dangerous. So this has happened, as I said, in 3 weeks. Today, even Goldman Sachs, even Morgan Stanley, even JP Morgan, that are very mainstream, are telling us that they predict that in the first quarter of this year, the one ending at the end of this month, already you'll have GDP, real economic activity, falling between 5 to 10% at the annual rate. And they predict that in the second quarter of this year, economic activity is going to fall at the annual rate between 25 to 30%. Now, we're not seeing numbers of down 30% of GDP, not even during the Great Depression, let alone during the global financial crisis. Why so much? Because suddenly nobody can work, nobody can open a store, nobody can do business. It's as if an asteroid that hit the entire planet Earth and shut down all economic activity in the US, in Europe, in Japan, in China, in emerging markets, in advanced economies. There's a shock we've not seen before. Usually if there is a recession, say in Europe, there may be economic growth in US or China or vice versa. This is a shock that's hit pretty much most of the world economy. So it's much worse. We've seen people discuss a few weeks ago whether this is going to be a V-shaped recovery, meaning a slowdown in one quarter and a rapid recovery to strong growth by the second quarter. This is not a V, it's not even a U, like we had after the global financial crisis, a gradual return to growth. It's not even an L, going down and then stagnating. It's not a W, a double dip recession is an I. What was an I? Free fall. Consumption is falling, capital spending is falling, exports are falling, imports are falling, residential investment is falling. We have not seen anything like this even during the Great Depression. Now, that's why a month ago, market commentators, self-serving, were talking about a correction, 10% down stock market, about the V-shaped recovery. This was nonsense, as I discussed already weeks ago. Now everybody, even Wall Street, agrees is going to be a nasty free fall, a greater recession. This is now the baseline. It's not anymore something like an auto consensus. The consensus says it's going to be worse than the global financial crisis. Now, there are two scenarios. Scenario number one is that we end up into this greater recession, as bad or worse than the global financial crisis, but it's going to be short. First quarter, second quarter, third quarter, but maybe by October and the fourth quarter of this year, there is some gradual return to economic growth being positive rather than being negative. This will be the best scenario. It's severe, it's brutal, it's nasty, but at least there is light at the end of the tunnel by the end of the year. This will be the greater recession scenario. Some people on Wall Street are as optimistic as saying that already by the third quarter, we're going to see positive growth. I don't think it's likely. But essentially, you see light at the end of the tunnel sometime in the second half of the year. That's possible, but I'm going to discuss three important conditions for that to happen. But if those conditions do not happen, there's a risk of a greater depression. And I'll explain you briefly what are the conditions under which this could end up being a greater depression. So what are the conditions for which we're going to have only a greater recession that is essentially the baseline? It looks ugly, but that's actually is an optimistic scenario because there'll be a recovery by the end of the year and the market are going to bottom out and gradually recover. Condition number one, we need the right health policy response. And the right health policy response means the following one. It's painful to shut down everything. It's painful to have a lockdown and having a full quarantine and everybody staying at home. But the experience of China suggests that if you shut down everything, if everybody stays at home January, February, and March, the number of new cases is gradually going to slow down and then eventually asymptotically go towards zero. And once that happens, you can reopen economic activity. It's going to be painful. It's going to be still a severe economic downturn, but at least people can start to live, to work, to do business, to consume, to spend. So that's what China has done. And that implies to do the following thing. You have to do massive testing, massive tracing. You have to do lockdowns and quarantines that are not voluntary, but they are really compulsory. Meaning in China, you get out of your home, they arrest you. They follow you with drones, with robots. They give you a card, green, yellow, red. If it's red or yellow, you have to stay at home. The whole system is Big Brother society. It's not what we want, but it was something that was necessary. And guess what? Now Italy, now India, now the UK are doing variants of the same. So think of it as not being mitigation. That is what the US is doing right now, but an attempt to have suppression, full suppression of the epidemic. Now, if you do that, in a matter of time, in China it took 3 months. In our case, you are behind the curve. It might take more like 4 or 5 months. But by July and August, the number of new cases goes to zero. And then by the third quarter or the fourth quarter, economic activity is restored. But you need to do something that implies a huge amount of economic pain. People don't spend, there's no business, no revenue, businesses are down, you shut down, but then you clean the system of the epidemic and then you can restart economic activity. That's the first condition. If you do the alternative of now, after a week, going back to not having any more social distancing and not having quarantines, the thing is going to get worse. I'll give you an example. Today, for the last week in the United States, the number of new cases is going up by 30% per day. Every 3 days, the number is doubling. That means that today we have 50,000 cases, but in a month from now, we're going to have 500,000. China stopped it after 80,000. Italy, where they did not stop it fast enough, and now they're doing the draconian Chinese style of policies, they're already at 50,000, in spite of being a country of 60 million people, as opposed to 1.4 in China. So we're having actually the wrong policy in the United States. We need to have compulsory quarantine and shut down the lockdown. We're not doing it. First point. Second point on the policy is you need to have the right monetary policy. And on that one, I have to give credit to the central banks of the world, the Federal Reserve in the United States, the European Central Bank. They're doing everything. They're doing stuff that you used to do 10 years ago, but 10 years ago, they went to these unconventional monetary policies. It took them 3 years. Now they've done it in 3 weeks. They've gone back to zero policy rates, or in Europe, negative. They've done quantitative easing, massive unlimited purchase of government bond. They've done credit easing, purchase of private assets. They've provided liquidity, not just to the banks, but also to non-bank financial institutions, to investment banks, to money market funds, to the commercial paper market where firms are issuing commercial paper to finance working capital. They're gonna even buy investment grade bonds in the United States, in Europe and Japan. They've done everything under the sun. It's a huge amount of money, but it's necessary because you don't want to be in a situation where people are illiquid, and because of illiquidity, they're gonna become insolvent, meaning bankrupt, because they have a cash flow problem for 3 or 6 months. So that policy of easy money and credit, unlimited, is happening. That's the good news. And the Fed is doing it, other central banks are doing it. Third kind of a key pillar of the right policy response is the right type of fiscal policy. Given the amount of shock to the economy, every private sector element of demand, consumption is falling, capital spending is falling, exports are falling. So the only agent in the economy who can spend more, either directly or by transferring money to the private sector, so the private sector does not collapse, is the government. The government has the balance sheet to borrow and spend and transfer more money. And that's where now you need a big bazooka, not just on the monetary, but also on the fiscal. People estimate that you need a budget deficit of at least 10% of GDP in order to try to backstop the economy for the next few months. And what they just passed in Congress goes in that direction. Other countries have not done it as big as the United States. Of course, you need to help those who need the money most. Big corporations are profitable, have a lot of cash. Big banks are going to get the liquidity support of the Fed. It's households and small businesses are in trouble. Think of it this way. In the US, about half of employed people are not formally employed, because the formally employed people, if they get unemployed, they have unemployment benefits, they have health insurance, they have a paid sick leave and other things of that sort. But our economy is based on things like gig workers, partially employed workers, self-employed workers, freelancers, contractors, hourly workers, undocumented workers, elderly people who work part-time, students who work part-time. All these people do not have a formal employment contract. Their income is going to zero. I live in New York, where everybody that was working in hotels, in restaurants, in bars, in music, in entertainment, nobody of these people was formally employed. They were all essentially contractors. They tell me their income is now zero. Everything has shut down. And they don't have the kind of benefits, unemployment benefit or healthcare, that people that are formally employed have. So if you're formally employed, you become unemployed, it's bad, they're gonna get a buffer of help. If you're otherwise not formally employed, you're really in trouble. So for example, having a transfer of $1,000 for every person is necessary, especially for those who are not formally employed. But that's not gonna be sufficient. People are not gonna be able to pay their rent, or pay their mortgage, or pay their phone bills, or internet bills, and so on. Unfortunately, we're gonna need a moratorium, especially for households that don't have income, and for small businesses that right now have no revenue, on all their debt payments and all their bills. If you don't do that, they're gonna go bankrupt. The alternative might be maybe for the Small Business Administration to lend them money at very low interest rates. But if you lend them money, they'll have to pay it back unless it's a grant. So most of the help has to go to poorer households that have a kind of a partial attachment to the labor force and to small businesses. Otherwise, you'll have an implosion or most of the economy. The other important point about the fiscal response, it has to be fully monetized by the Fed. Because if you're gonna have a $3 trillion budget deficit, we're already adding one and we're adding another two, and you're issuing another $3 trillion of bonds on the existing stock of 20, interest rates that are very low right now on government debt are gonna go higher, and that's gonna crowd out the recovery of residential investment, of capital spending by the corporation or consumption by the private sector. To prevent interest rates from going higher, you have to do full monetization. So essentially you monetize the budget deficit. Every bond issued by the government is going to be bought by the Fed. Now, this idea of monetizing fiscal deficit used to be considered as a radical leftist idea. A bunch of leftist academics under the rubric of modern monetary theory were supporting the idea of monetizing fiscal deficits. It was also called helicopter drop of money or people's QE. But guess what? In the last year, mainstream economists like the former chairman, Fed chairman Ben Bernanke, or the former vice chair of the Fed Stan Fischer, who now works for BlackRock, the biggest asset manager in the world, Ray Dalio, the biggest hedge fund manager in the world, they all say we should do essentially a helicopter drop. Now, they don't call it helicopter drop. What do they call it? They call it coordination of monetary and fiscal policy. But what does coordination of monetary fiscal policy means? We have a huge budget deficit, and the Fed is going to buy the bonds that is being issued by the Treasury, so interest rates don't go higher. It's necessary, and in a situation which have a collapse of demand is not going to be even in the short run inflationary. So that's what needs to be done, and I think it's going to be done. It's a revolution. There is no more independence of the Fed, but we need it because otherwise the alternative is going to be much worse. Now, if all these three things happen, you get a greater recession. However, I fear for three reasons that we might end up into a greater depression. Let me explain why. Reason number one is the health response. What's happening in the United States is totally crazy. For the president to say we need to have people go back to work by next Monday is the wrong policy response, because the lesson of China compared to Italy shows us that if you shut down everything for 3 months, you stop the pandemic, the number of new cases go to zero, you have a 1 or 2 quarters of really bad economic activity, and then you go back gradually to normal, because essentially you have killed the virus for the time being. And that's what needs to be done. If instead you essentially kick the can down the road like Italy did, and you don't do radical compulsory quarantines and lockdown, look at Italy, where right now is a nightmare. The number of cases is going 30% per day. The number of dead people is 8% of the cases, and you have a total medical and health nightmare. So it's painful, of course, because everybody's going to be having less income for 3-4 months, but that's the right thing to do. Because if you don't do it and you restart economic activity before the contagion has been stopped, then there'll be a spread of the contagion, as any model of mitigation as opposed to suppression shows. And then once you're going to have, a month from now, 500,000 cases in the United States, you'll have to stop economic activity even more radically, not for 3 months, but for 6-9 months. And that's going to be a nightmare. Unfortunately, the president, in spite of the advice of his scientific and medical advisor like Dr. Fauci, want to restart economic activity next week. When India, with 1.4 billion people, Modi has said, you stay at home. Where even in the UK, that bozo of Bojo is telling people compulsory stay at home. And the same thing is happening right now in France, in Germany, in Italy. It's painful, but you need to do it. Unfortunately, we're not going to do it. Not only we're not going to do it, but even the form of mitigation, let alone suppression, that has occurred so far might be eased. And that's even more crazy. Now, however, even if we were doing suppression, the reality is that any scientific model suggests that by the winter of next year, essentially by the 4th quarter, November, December, the virus is going to come back. It's going to come back in a different mutation. We don't know exactly what. And every model suggests that while there'll be a spike right now, there'll be another spike starting next winter. Now, if we do suppression today, the spike is going to be smaller next winter. If you do mitigation, it's going to be a huge spike this year and again next winter. But at least if we do suppression, it will be less so. However, we're going to have another spike. So think of it this way. By the fourth quarter of this year, when economic activity should be returning to positive growth after 3 quarters of negative, if there is another pandemic spreading with a new mutation, we'll have trouble again. And by that time, most of the population is not going to be immune. We are not going to find yet a vaccine. It takes 12 to 18 months. And unless we have some miracle antivirals or therapeutics available to 7 billion people around the world, we're not going to be able to suppress this second wave. And the second wave is going to be bigger in countries that have done mitigation rather than suppression. And here in the US, we're in mitigation light, not even in serious mitigation. So unfortunately, it's a case that we're going to have another cycle exactly when economy has to be recovering. And therefore, you could have another cycle of fourth quarter of next year through the summer of 2021 when you have economic downturn. First observation. Second risk of a greater depression is that for a year, you can run a budget deficit of $2-3 trillion. $3 trillion is going to be 15% of GDP and monetize it, they're printing money, and nothing is going to happen. It's going to be okay. But you can fool all of the people some of the time, some of the people all of the time. You cannot fool all of the investors all of the time. You're going to run a budget deficit of 10, 15% of GDP and printing money to finance it. We end up like Zimbabwe, like Argentina, like Venezuela, with high inflation and eventually hyperinflation. Because if there is a negative supply shock to the economy, the negative supply shock is supply chains are disrupted. Today, there are not even enough workers in California to pick up the fruits and the vegetables. So the food supply chain is going to be blocked. We're going to have more deglobalization, more decoupling from China, more reshoring of economic activity, more fragmentation of the global economy, more balkanization. All these things of having less of international trade, globalization means less production, more cost of production, and therefore you have less growth and more inflation. Whenever there is a negative supply shock, reduces output and increases prices, like the oil shock in the 70s, 73 and 79, when you print money and you do budget deficits, you end up with what? Eventually end up with stagflation. Stagflation is a combination of economic stagnation, recession, and high inflation. Today we have stagnation or recession with deflation because demand is collapsing. But if you keep on doing the same policy when the supply side is negative, meaning you've had a shock, reduces economic activity and increases cost, you're going to end up with inflation and depression rather than deflation and repression.
So Nouriel, yes. So we've covered a lot so far. So yeah. Can we do a quick review for all the people who have been joining us and kind of explore a few questions in that process? Is that okay?
Yeah, maybe just 1 minute. I'm not going to elaborate it right now. Maybe we're going to make another call. I wanted to make the third point that in addition to the return of the pandemic and eventually our policy causing inflation and depression, we may have a wide range of geopolitical shock between US and China, global cyber warfare, conflicts in the Middle East. There are going to be additional geopolitical tension that on top of an economic depression may lead to a geopolitical depression. And those shocks could end up being more severe than the coronavirus crisis. I don't have today the time to flesh it out. I wrote about it last month on Project Syndicate, but I think it's the combination of continued pandemic, running out of policy bullets, and having geopolitical depression, this trifecta or this Bermuda Triangle that gets you a greater depression. That's just as a point to be made right now.
Got it. So first of all, that was a ton for us to absorb. Let's break it down piece by piece, right? So in your first part, you discussed your argument for why you believe that at the very least we are going to have a greater recession, potentially a greater depression, right? Yeah. And you brought up a few critical points. One is that when the Great Depression occurred, and the global economic crisis, you said it took about 3 years for the effects to be felt. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, for this train wreck causing all the economic, financial, and other effects, it was a slow motion train wreck. Didn't occur in 3 weeks. Yeah.
And now we're seeing it all essentially happen suddenly.
In a month. Yeah, totally. It's called now a sudden stop. There's a sudden stop of economic activity and financial markets. That's what people call it, the sudden stop.
Got it. And essentially part of your argument is that in order to ensure our well-being and long-term functionality, we should actually take it, not focus on that aspect of it, but take it one step further and ensure that everybody stays home, close shops completely, and take essentially a draconian rule to prevent any further outbreak rather than the consideration of the end of social distancing. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly.
Great. Now, your second point was, could you remind?
Well, I said first the right health response. That means compulsory quarantine and lockdown for as long as it takes until you stop the spread. The second one was massive monetary easing. And the third one was fiscal policy that is going to be fully monetized in terms of the budget deficit.
Got it. Now, is there a risk in terms, you mentioned that if we keep printing money at a high percentage of GDP and increase our debt, then we'll end up in stagflation? Is that right?
Yeah. So, recession and inflation rather than recession and deflation. Yeah.
Got it. So traditionally, when there's a lack of, when there's a recession, the currency becomes more valuable rather than less valuable. But if we keep printing money, then our savings essentially become less valuable. And we get to situations like in Zimbabwe, where you are a multi-time Zimbabwe billionaire. Is that right?
Something like that. We're not going to get up like Zimbabwe, but look at the 1970s. There was an oil shock in 1973, following the Yom Kippur War between Israel and the Arab states. There was Iranian Revolution in 1979. This was a negative supply shock that led to higher oil prices. We went into a recession. We printed money. We ran budget deficit, and we ended up with double-digit inflation. So you had the recession with inflation. Usually when you have a recession, demand is down, so prices should be falling. Inflation should be lower or should have deflation, like the global financial crisis. But if the shock is not a demand shock, but a supply shock, in this case, coronavirus, global supply chain shutdown, or an oil shock, then a negative supply shock reduces output and increases prices, and it causes inflation. And if you try to avoid it by kicking the can down the road, it causes more inflation, more debt, more monetization, and then you end up into stagflation.
Got it. So it's a byproduct of the fact that there just isn't anything for us to buy, so we're all willing to spend whatever we need. So the dollar becomes less valuable, and then we're stuck in a worse situation. There's been this term being thrown around in Congress of the digital dollar as this new concept. Do you see any value in that?
Well, that's a different story. Cash as paper money in the next few years is going to disappear. It's already disappeared in Sweden and in China, where even the few beggars on the street are using a QR code on their cell phone to get money from you. And therefore, central banks around the world are thinking about whether they should be introducing a central bank digital currency or an e-currency or an e-dollar. Now, the people that are in the crypto world or in blockchain, they get all excited. They say, you see, we're going to have a cryptocurrency of the government. But if you talk to these government officials, and I've talked to all of them, you're not going to have something that is on a distributed ledger. It's not going to be decentralized. It's not going to be privately run or anonymous. It's going to be a centralized ledger run by the central bank. Today, every bank in the US has access to the balance sheet of the Fed. That's how the interbank money market works. Suppose that you and I, every individual, every business, has an account with the Fed, then we can make transaction without using checks, without using cash, and without using the banks and our deposits in the bank and doing wire transfer or checks. So effectively, your big deposit is with the central bank, and you can do payment system by using a centralized ledger. When there is this proposal in the US, we'll see whether it's going to be implemented or not, because there are many pros and cons. We'll have an e-dollar, but the e-dollar has nothing to do with crypto, has nothing to do with blockchain. It's a fully centralized, private, and controlled by one agent, the Fed, kind of a system. So it has nothing to do with DLT technology.
So what are the
advantage of it is the following one. Today, we'll have to do a check of $1,000 to every American, right? That's what was passed by Congress. Some people file their taxes, and they're going to get it that way because the government knows who you are. Some people have a bank account. Some people have Venmo, PayPal. Some people maybe are not filing taxes because they're too poor. So we don't have a system for quickly transferring $1,000 to every American. Suppose that you have a digital dollar and every American has an account with the central bank. You can do it in 24 hours. That's what they've done actually in India. In India, they have a system of welfare transfer based on essentially the government giving a digital identity to every single Indian. And then there is this M-Pesa that is essentially a digital money. It's a private system. And you can use the government system and the private one to essentially make transfer payments. So that's the direction of essentially having a digital currency centralized that allows to transfer money and do helicopter drop very fast. Because of course, you're not going to have a helicopter dropping money in the streets. It's a metaphor for transferring money to people.
So let's take this to more of a global situation. You talked about how China and Italy are using more draconian law. I'm not sure, in a state of emergency, are we allowed to, in this country, keep people in their homes and so on? Is that even an option according to the US Constitution?
I'm not a legal expert, but I think that even at the local level, say in the state of New York or California, the governors essentially have said they said everybody should be staying at home. All stores and other, apart from essential, are closed. I don't know whether it can go to the level in which is compulsory, and if you get out, then you can be arrested. I'm not a legal expert, but if you say it's compulsory, I would say 99% of the people are going to stay at home for as long as it takes. But even in Italy, you're allowed, one, to go out for an emergency. Two, if you are an essential worker. Three, you can go to the supermarket and buy food if you cannot order it online. Four, you can go to a pharmacy. There's another exception. You're allowed to take your dog out for a walk. So people who don't want to stay at home, they take their dog out 20 times a day. But those cheaters then are caught by the police and say, enough of spending the day outside with your dog. So, it's not really staying at home 24/7, but it's close to that. And
so in honor of that,
legal terms of making sure that people stay at home. If you decide it at the top and you say everybody should be doing it, if there is social capital, if there is civil conscience, you're going to have people doing it, and you're not going to need to arrest them. But you need to have that social capital and institution that people have in China, but not just in China, where you have police state, in Japan, in Hong Kong, in Singapore, in Korea, where the government tells you, stay at home, you stay at home. Even in Italy, where people are not exactly so rule-abiding, when the government said you have to stay at home, they stayed at home. So you can make it effectively compulsory, regardless of what are the legal constraints.
I know we don't have a ton of time left. What I'd love to do is discuss, you had mentioned something really important, which is that much of the American population has about $400 in savings for emergency situations.
Yeah.
And we're
the
approaching...
according to the Fed, 40% of all US households have not more than $400 of cash or savings for an emergency. It's scary because I'm sure pretty much everybody on this call who is educated, who has human capital skills, probably middle class, is not in that category, but literally half of America is desperate, has been left behind, and 40% of Americans have only $400. This is an official number by the Federal Reserve.
And you had mentioned that when April 1st comes around and bills are due, there's going to be a major issue, assuming that there's no no money delivered to them to help them both pay for their bills and forgiveness on late fees to their credit cards, home bills, so on and so forth. What do you think the risk of actual civil unrest is?
Well, you have three groups of people. You have those who are formally employed. As long as they're not being fired, they're going to keep their jobs and most of their income. Even if you get fired, if you're formally employed, you're going to have extended unemployment benefits. They're going to be more generous than the past. You have access to paid sick leave that has been extended. You have access to healthcare. So even if you get fired for about a year or so, you have a buffer. The categories at risk are people, as I pointed out, that are essentially gig workers, contractors, self-employed, freelancers, partially employed, hourly workers, undocumented. These people, they don't have any of the formal employment contracts. They can be let go in a second, and they don't have access not even to unemployment benefit. Many of them may not even have healthcare. Many more have gotten Obamacare in the last few years, but there are at least 20 million Americans who don't. When I talk to these people, and I know a whole bunch of them in New York, they tell me, April 1st, I cannot pay my rent. And a few of them with the mortgage, I cannot pay my mortgage. I'm not gonna have enough money to pay even my telephone or internet or my electricity utility bills. And the $1,000 that the government is gonna give me in two tranches, 500 in April, 500 in May, allows me to survive, maybe to eat some food and so on. And after that, I'm on my own. Now, even if you have a moratorium on all debt payments, and I think it's gonna come, because either the government is gonna decide if you don't have income, you shouldn't pay rent or your mortgage, you shouldn't pay your utility bills, and we're gonna give you enough money to have food for a while. Either you do it formally, or informally, everybody's gonna stop paying rent and mortgages and their bills. And I don't think anybody's gonna be evicted. So either de facto or de jure, we're gonna have that moratorium. Even with that moratorium, if you have no income, the $1,000 is gonna make you live for food and basic essentials for a month, maybe a month and a half, not much more than that. And therefore, either do another round of it in June, July, and as long as it takes until you get a job, or people are gonna literally be starving, even if they don't pay rent, even if they don't pay their utility bills, and then you could have riots in the streets and people mobbing the supermarkets and stealing the essentials. We're not there. We're maybe not gonna get there, but we have half of America that after this $1,000 is gonna be gone, they're not gonna have any money to survive, even if they default on all their credit cards, auto loans, student loans, utility bills, mortgages, rent, and everything else. Even if all that happens, you don't have enough money to survive. This is how severe this is.
So I know that certain, first of all, that's staggering. Second of all, I know that there's been I know that foreign countries have worked on a negative interest rate.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the pros and cons of what that actually means? Like companies are getting paid to borrow money. Is that right?
Well, you know, it's a bit of an arcane kind of a policy tool. In the US, we went to zero, and we never went to negative policy rates. While in the Eurozone, in Japan, and in a few other European countries, Sweden, Denmark, and Switzerland, when the policy rate went to zero, it became negative. So if a bank has excess liquidity that is held at the central bank, holding it as these digital deposits with the central bank, then they have to pay an interest rate that is negative. Minus 60 today in the Eurozone, used to be, is minus 75 in Switzerland. Now, of course, you have an alternative to paying interest that is negative, is going into cash. But going into cash by the trillions is very hard for a bank because, you know, there are storage costs and so on. So there is a limit to how much you can go negative. And of course, if you're holding idle reserves with the central bank and you're paying minus 60 negative interest rates, you might have an incentive to lend that money to businesses and earn a positive return as opposed to keeping it idle. That's the logic of this policy. You don't want banks having all this liquidity held at central bank not used. You want to lend it to the real economy. And the more you go negative, the more you give an incentive to banks to lend it, as opposed to keep it in their pockets and pay negative interest rates. That's why this policy in Europe, among others, has been implemented and has worked, because since they implemented this policy in 2015, Eurozone was at the risk of recession and deflation, then the economy recovered. That's the logic of this policy. I don't think the Fed is going to go to negative policy rates, because they have every other tool. They can do forward guidance, they can do quantitative easing, they can do credit easing, they can do unlimited support of the financial system, they can backstop the muni bonds, they can backstop commercial paper, corporate bonds, they can buy private assets of every sort, stuff that has been done in Europe and Japan as well. There's one thing that US has not done, going negative with the policy rate. It's not a big deal, because actually everything else in the bazooka is so big that going negative or not doesn't make much of a difference. It's nice to do it if you want to. If you don't do it, it's not a big deal.
Now, as far as the situation evolves and how it affects us as individuals, I know that you probably aren't going to give us any direct business advice, but are there any areas that seem safer than others? Should I demand that all my clients pay me in gold bullion and hand it to me in briefcases? Like, should I be asking for bonds, or where are the safer bets right now?
Listen, we can have maybe a separate call on what are going to be the market implications. The market fell, stock market 35% from the peak in the last couple of days because of the fiscal bazooka has been going up. In my view, all the policy good news are going to be already in the market priced in by tomorrow, because people know big monetary bazooka, big fiscal bazooka. That's already priced in. But from now on, you'll have bad news on the health and the spread of the contagion and how severe the recession is going to be. So people think we reached the bottom 2 days ago, and now we're going to recover and go up in a straight line. I think there'll be plenty of negative shocks that are going to push the market down. Now, that's for the stock market. At some point, it's going to bottom out. But when it's going to bottom out and how much it's going to recover depends on whether we're going to have a greater recession or a greater depression. And for now, is anybody's guess. Your money in the banks for now is safe. It's safe because while there is a limit to deposit insurance, during the 2008 crisis, since people were worried about their deposits in the bank, there was a beginning of a run on the banks. And then the Fed said, okay, deposit insurance is not up to 100,000 per depositor, but it's going to be unlimited. So if you see a problem with the banks, and today the banks have enough capital and liquidity to be safe, your money in the bank doesn't earn you anything, zero, but it's safe. You're not going to have they're not going to default on you. If you want to go into gold, there is an argument that in this world where there is there is a risk of eventual inflation and there is a risk of financial crisis, gold is going to become stronger. Certainly that's the case, but it's not going to be linear. There were, during the last month, many days when gold was going down rather than up, when the stock market was falling 5-10%. Why? If you're leveraged to the stock market, you lose money. You have to sell your winners to raise enough cash to deal with the margin calls. So if the shock is bad enough, gold goes down rather than going up. So I would not recommend everybody to go into gold. Some people believe that crypto is the way to go, but guess what? Since the financial crisis started in February, Bitcoin has gone down by 50%. And other shitcoins, there are 3,000 of them, have already lost 99% of the value from their peak 2 years ago, and have fallen more than 60% in the last month. Some people are arguing that cryptocurrency will be a good edge against bad times, that they go up when there is risk off and the stock market is down. We've had an experiment now of the biggest risk off crisis in the last 20 years. And guess what? Shitcoins have gone deeper down. The stock market fell 30%. The average shitcoin lost 60% of its value. You don't want to be in crypto. It's not safe. So that's not certainly nowhere to go. If you want to be into something, maybe gold is better. I'm skeptical about gold as being the solution to every problem, but it's a good edge against inflation, against debasement, and against maybe financial crisis. But certainly not cryptocurrencies.
So I'm sure you've spent a lot of time looking at what are the potential second and third order implications of the crisis. And I don't know if we'll have time to go into it in depth because we have about 5 minutes.
Social, economical, political, what second, third order? There are many different dimensions. I think we're going to live in a very different world. Especially, socially, maybe the silver lining is we're going to do more telecommuting or teleconferencing. So maybe it's going to improve the environment by having less air transportation and less car use. But socially, if we're going to be having more virtual relationships rather than face-to-face, we're going to get depressed. And everybody now is online, but it's not the same thing as having a coffee face-to-face with somebody. Political, I think that we're in a process of not only deglobalization, but a backlash, a populist backlash against trade, migration, globalization, liberal democracy. Populist parties of the extreme right and left are becoming more powerful and popular around the world. Liberal democracy is a threat. There is lots of other stuff that are dangerous. They may lead us, like in the 30s, to a situation where the Great Depression led them to what? Mussolini in power in Italy, Hitler in Germany, Franco in Spain, authoritarian militarists in Japan, and then we ended up with World War II. Today we have a Cold War, a Thucydides trap between US and China. This Cold War is going to become colder as both sides are accusing each other and blaming each other for this crisis. The Cold War on tech, on trade, on finance, on currency, on our political system is going to get worse. We'll have more decoupling between US and China. There are tensions in the Strait of Formosa, in the East South China Sea. Could that Cold War become a hot war? Graham Allison, who wrote the book on the Thucydides trap, says in 12 out of 16 cases in history, when you had a rising power facing an existing power, was a hot war, not a cold war. Those are things that you have to start to think about. There's, of course, also global climate change is becoming worse. Maybe if we start using less traditional economic activity, one of the few silver linings of this crisis is that if you look at the maps of the sky and the world, the amount of greenhouse gas emission has collapsed because economic activity is shut down. And scientists tell me that even 3 months of having lower emission can restart and improve the ecosystem, even 3 months of it. So maybe this should go on for 6 months so we give a chance to the planet to survive, because otherwise we're on a slow motion train wreck for the environment. So those
I'm
are some
happy
of the
there's at least a silver lining somewhere in this scenario. Nouriel, thank you so much for all of your insight, your time. We're incredibly appreciative. And if there are any last questions, if anybody wants to throw it in there, please do. Other than that, you can feel free to unmute yourself for a moment just to clap, because that was just a...
Thank you.
Thank you.
I did a live Twitter event today on my Twitter, Nouriel, and I'm going to do something similar sometime Friday morning and next week as well. So you can also
people
follow
mute
me
yourself,
on Twitter.
please.
Huh?
Thank you. I'm just telling people to mute themselves again because we're getting feedback.
Yeah. If you follow me on Twitter, I did an event live like this one on Twitter, and I'm going to do another one on Friday, maybe next week. And I'm happy to do with you, John, and whoever wants to join us, something next week or two, and we can talk more about the markets or anything that's of interest. So maybe let's continue the conversation.
Thank you so much. I also want to thank everybody for coming today. I want to thank, we had an incredible group of guests. Sister company Brunchwork participated with us. So thank you all from Brunchwork for coming and joining us. And thank you for all of you who are out there making an incredible impact. I've heard stories about people doing everything from buying masks and delivering them to hospitals to arranging for production, investing into organizations working on vaccines. So there's incredible work that's taking place. Nouriel, and one other thing, Nouriel pointed out that even under draconian rule of being locked in your home, you can still go out if you need to walk a dog. I will provide a link for a adoption agency so that all of us have an excuse to leave our house from time to time, and you can all find yourself a pup that you can spend time with. So thank you all for coming. This has been an absolute pleasure. If anybody wants to stay on and chat with us for a bit. Also, what we do very much welcome is suggestions for what you want to hear about in the coming weeks, because we want to keep bringing you actual experts, not just hearing paranoid stories from YouTube and the rumor mill of the internet. So please, yes, foster a dog, Amir. Thank you.
I'll stay on for another 10 minutes if anybody wants to.
Wonderful. Yeah. So if anybody has a question, you can feel free to just don't go all at once, unmute, but make sure that it is on topic and go for it.
Nouriel, I'd like to ask you, in 2008, hi, my name is Vasilis. Thank you very much, first of all, for your talk. It was very insightful. In 2008, there was money printing, which substituted basically the investment. The corporate world investment slowed down. As a result, we didn't have inflation. Why do you think that this time we end up in inflation, given that the corporate sector, the private sector has no investment in the economy, so the government comes in and substitutes this part? Thank you.
Well, initially, this was a negative supply shock. Essentially, China could not produce and global supply chains were essentially disrupted. But now, the shutdown of economic activity is a collapse also of aggregate demand. So for this year, I think that the fall in aggregate demand is going to be bigger than the fall in aggregate supply. You'll have more unemployment rate, you'll have excess capacity, and because of that, we're going to end up into less inflation, like during the global financial crisis. After the global financial crisis, we had recession and deflationary pressure. What I'm saying, however, is that the global financial crisis was a negative demand shock. There was too much debt and leverage. People had to stop spending, and then you had a recession, and that fall in demand led to deflation. This time around, we have a disruption to supply chains. We'll have even disruption I fear, to food supply. I really worry that we're not going to have enough workers in the field to pick up the fruits or to cultivate them, and then the food chain of production. Suppose a bunch of factories where you're producing the food, you have cases of coronavirus and they have to shut them down. And now we have the Cold War with China, and we have deglobalization, and we have decoupling, and we have reshoring of global supply chains, stuff that is disruptive of economic activity. We have protectionism, we have tariffs, we have inward policies. We may even have a war between US and Iran that spikes oil prices. All this stuff are not negative demand shock, they're negative supply shock that reduces output and increases costs. Now, if you have a negative supply shock rather than a negative demand shock, and you add to it money and deficit, you end up like the 70s. Eventually, inflation expectation rise because costs are rising, then wages are rising, the prices are rising, then costs are rising, and you end up in a bad equilibrium where expected inflation goes higher, prices, wages, cost of production, currencies are devalued, import prices go higher, and you end up in a bad equilibrium with high inflation and recession. That happened before in the advanced economies in the 70s with double-digit inflation. The worst example, of course, are cases where huge deficits monetized lead to hyperinflation. We're not yet Zimbabwe, but we've seen this horror movie in the 70s in the US and Europe. So if this shock remains for a year or two or three, and we're in a greater depression, it's not going to be deflationary. Eventually could be inflationary, given these sets of policy. We're not yet there, but in the next couple of years, we could end up there. That's the only point I was making.
Thank you.
Raise your hand if you send a message to all of us on if you have a question, just to raise your hand. Oh, Betty, it seems that you have a question.
I do. Hi, thank you. Thank you, Nouriel. Since the whole decision to continue lockdown mode seems to be so critical right now for whether we end up in a recession or depression, do you have any confidence that, I'm not sure what combination of force does this among the people around our president, but do you feel that he's actually just floating a trial balloon, or does he need to be wrestled to the ground by whoever is in a position to do so, to change his mind about lifting all of the shelter-in-place rules in time for Easter?
I'm not sure. His own scientific advisors tell him this is a crazy idea. And actually the mitigation has become more severe and go into suppression mode, because even our mitigation is mitigation light compared to other countries. So we're not even doing full mitigation, let alone suppression. And even if he's thinking about his own political future, he wants to win the election, and he worries that if the recession goes all year long, he's going to be in trouble. That's why he wants to start business again. It's not in his interest, because if you start business again and then literally in a month, instead of 500,000, in a month we'll be at 500,000 guaranteed. The risk is not that we're going to be at 500,000 cases in the US. It's going to be 1 million or 2. And once you're at 1 million and 2, you start economic activity in April and May, and then by June you have to shut it down for not 2 months, but for 6 months. Because once the genie is out of the bottle, it's going to take 6 months then to do real suppression. So even if he's thinking about November and winning the election, and he's in his own self-interest, it's better to swallow the bitter pill of a severe recession right now until June. Then you have $2 trillion of economic boost that's going to maybe by the fourth quarter improve the economy, and maybe everything else equal, you can still win the election. So I don't even understand his own selfish logic. What is it? Because even from his own point of view, wanting to be reelected, he should actually go for suppression, because you take the pain frontally, and then maybe things going to improve by late summer. Otherwise, it's going to be for sure a depression, and then it's going to lose for sure. So I don't even understand his word logic, why he's not listening to the advisors.
We have
really don't get it.
We have 3 last questions, and we'll try to get them through them very quickly. Era, you had a question?
Yeah. Hi, Nouriel. I have a question on the dollar strength and the dollar funding squeeze. Right now, given the continuing rise of deficit and also debt monetization by Fed, how would be the dynamic for the dollar strength to become, and when foreign countries have the dollar funding need?
Well, what's happening is in the last couple of weeks, the dollar was becoming stronger for 2 reasons. Usually when there is risk of people going to safe assets, and while things are bad in the US, they're worse in other parts of the world. And people think that US Treasury and dollars are safer than euro or yen or Chinese currency or emerging markets. So the rush to treasuries and to the dollar strengthens the dollar. Second reason is that there is, as you point out, a lack of dollar in the rest of the world. Corporations and governments in emerging markets, in Asia and Europe, banks and others, have borrowed in dollar, and they need to pay their dollars, but they don't have dollars. And therefore, everybody's scrambling to save dollar or to buy dollar. That strengthens the dollar. And that strengthening of the dollar weakens other currency and causes more distress for governments and corporations that borrowed in dollar. The real value of their debt goes higher. So there are 2 solutions to this problem. One is what the Fed has done, lending dollars, hundreds of billions, to other central banks, the ECB, DOJ, emerging markets. If you lend dollars to the other central banks, the central banks of Europe and Asia can lend those dollars to their own corporation, to their own banks, and therefore the pressure of dollar liquidity is reduced. Secondly, many emerging markets have borrowed a lot abroad, and now they have a squeeze, they have a sudden stop of capital. Money is rushing out of emerging markets because they're more risky in bad times. So that's where the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, that are the 2 big international banks, they already have committed to lend to emerging markets about $1 trillion. And already about 50 countries are applying to the IMF and the World Bank to get this money, because otherwise they go bankrupt on their dollar debts. So if the Fed lends the money and the IMF does so, we'll have less of a problem. But even $1 trillion from the IMF may not be sufficient, because emerging markets are half of the global economy. Their dollar debts are not $1 trillion, but several trillion. So maybe the IMF will have to borrow more or receive more capital from its members in order to be able to lend more. So at the national level, the central bank is a national lender of last resort to their own firms and banks. But if you are an economy that's dollar debt and the central bank of your country doesn't have the dollar, then you need an international lender of last resort who can print the dollar and lend them to you. That's why, in addition to the domestic lender of last resort, central bank, you need the international lender of last resort. There are 2 of them. either the IMF or the Federal Reserve. They can print the dollar and lend it to other countries.
Thank you for that. All right.
John, can I ask a question?
We have a bit of a lineup. Who was that?
It's Moran.
Oh, Moran. Joe is
Yeah,
next.
I have
Joe,
about 4 minutes left, then I have to go. So unfortunately,
Joe, do you have a quick question?
Yeah, just really, really quickly. I thank you once again for coming. And my question is regarding like the $2 trillion stimulus package, the additional like $600 a week of unemployment insurance is pretty unprecedented in the United States as far as like fiscal support is concerned. Have you had a chance to include this in your analysis as far as like the requisite fiscal policy that would support an October recovery? Or do you think that there's some sort of hazard, like conservative politicians have postulated, that this will incentivize Americans not to return to work when there is demand for it?
Well, you know, Republican conservatives have been always against extending unemployment benefits because they say if they're too generous, then you'd rather stay at home and not work. But unless they're really European style of benefits, where you can essentially have those benefits for years, and you could have that distorted incentive, I think that the extension of unemployment benefits that's occurring in the United States is not going to incentivize people to stay at home. You know, it's hard enough when you're fully employed and you're an hourly worker or you have minimum wage to have enough to survive, especially if you have a spouse and you have children. So the idea that I'm going to get $600-700 for a year and then I'm going to stay at home is ludicrous. Nobody can survive on that. The amounts are still too small, and the extension of it, while being positive, is not sufficient to disincentive people from going to work. Unfortunately, people have to work. Your husband, your wife, even your adult children, to survive in America. So you cannot live on unemployment benefits more than a few months. So I don't think they're so generous. We're going to have that negative incentive.
Last question, really quick. Moran Bar-Kokhba, I've tried to unmute you.
Hey, Nouriel, thanks again for this very interesting conversation. If you are the advisor to the next president, what kind of a new deal would you propose to him, or him, definitely?
Well, we have to resolve these crises, and there are crisis things, but our country has bigger problems. We have to really invest in our people. We have to be able to deal with the changes that AI, robotic and automation can imply in terms of technological unemployment. So you have to make sure that people are not left behind, that globalization and digitalization is good for everybody, not only for the top 20, 30% of people who have skills, education, human capital like this on this call, so that everybody can survive and thrive. We also need a Green New Deal because the environment is becoming a disaster. And unless we invest into the Green New Deal, then we're going to have environmental nightmares. People talk about this pandemic as being a natural disaster. They think about hurricanes being natural disaster. They're not natural disasters, they're man-made. There are actually scientific links between poor environment, poor health policies, and having these pandemics becoming more frequent and more virulent. It's just a manifestation of man-made disaster, both global climate change and pandemic. These are not natural disasters. So we don't want these things to happen and become worse. We have really to invest into a greener future as well, and a healthier future as well.
Thank you very much, Nouriel. At this point, we just want to say once again, what an incredible presentation you did. And thank you for taking the time. And we will catch all of you next week with our next segment in the series of Real Experts with Real Answers. Take care.
Thank you all.